Night arrived softly in Rome, not with celebration, but with a tired sigh. The heat of the day faded from the stone streets, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Oil lamps were lit one by one, their flames trembling in the warm air. Somewhere far away, a dog barked, then went silent. Inside a modest house near the edge of the city, a young bride sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the sounds of a life she was about to leave behind. She had been awake since before sunrise. Women had come early, filling the house with murmurs and practiced movements. They washed her, dressed her, and arranged her hair with careful hands that did not linger. Everything followed rules older than anyone present. No one asked how she felt. No one needed to. Her role was to endure, not to speak. The room smelled of wool, smoke, and faint traces of crushed herbs. Her wedding garment rested heavy on her shoulders, plain but symbolic. Around her waist was tied a woolen knot, pulled tight, pressing into her skin. It was said to protect fertility, but it felt more like a restraint. She breathed slowly, counting each breath, as she had learned to do when fear threatened to rise. Outside, voices grew louder. The groom's party was approaching. Laughter echoed along the street, uneven and sharp, carried by wine and expectation. The bride lowered her eyes. She had been taught that a bride must appear modest, hesitant, even afraid. It was considered proper. It showed respect for the power being transferred from her father's house to her husband's. When the door opened, the cool night air rushed in. Torches flickered, casting restless shadows across the walls. The groom stepped inside, surrounded by friends who watched with open curiosity. This was not a private moment. It was a public passage, observed and judged. The bride felt a hand grasp her arm firmly. It was not cruel, but it was not gentle either. The message was clear enough. As tradition demanded, she resisted just enough for the performance. Women cried out, half in jest, half in memory. The ritual echoed an ancient story Rome loved to tell itself, a tale of beginnings and necessity. But standing there, with her heart racing and her future narrowing, the bride understood the truth beneath the myth. This was not history being honored. This was control being repeated. She was led to the threshold of her new home. The stone step seemed higher than it should have been. She hesitated, and for a brief moment, time stretched. Then she was lifted and carried across. Laughter followed, easing the tension for everyone except her. The door closed behind them with a dull sound that settled deep in her chest. Inside, the house felt unfamiliar and watchful. Lamps burned low, filling the space with wavering light. The groom's mother waited nearby, her expression calm and distant. She nodded once, acknowledging the transfer that had just taken place. No words of comfort were offered. None were expected. The bride was guided to a small room at the back. A bed stood ready, covered with thick blankets. It looked solid and unyielding. She stood beside it, hands trembling now despite her efforts. The groom's friends lingered at the doorway, exchanging final remarks before leaving. Their footsteps faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that pressed in from all sides. The bride remained standing, listening to her own breath. This was the moment Rome would later soften with poetry. But here, in the quiet, it was simply a beginning shaped by fear, duty, and the weight of an empire's unspoken rules. The silence did not last long. The groom moved about the room, removing his cloak, setting aside his belt. Each small sound felt amplified, like a signal she could not escape. The bride stood still, her eyes fixed on a crack in the wall, tracing its uneven line as if it might lead somewhere else. She had been told this night was sacred, necessary, honorable. Yet nothing about it felt gentle. He approached slowly. His presence filled the space, bringing with it the certainty of what was expected. He reached for the woolen knot at her waist and pulled. The fibers tightened, then loosened, falling away. It was a simple act, yet it carried the weight of law and custom. With that knot undone, her old life officially ended. She sat when he gestured for her to do so. The bed creaked softly beneath her weight. She kept her hands folded, her movements small. Fear lived in her chest now, steady and sharp. She did not fight it. Fighting only made it worse. Instead, she focused on enduring, on becoming still enough that the moment might pass more quickly. The ritual demanded proof. Not spoken, but understood. Rome required signs that order had been maintained, that roles had been fulfilled. The bride closed her eyes as the night unfolded, her thoughts drifting away from the room, away from herself. She remembered the sound of water flowing near her childhood home, the way sunlight once fell through olive leaves. These memories felt distant now, like borrowed dreams. When it was over, exhaustion settled over her like a heavy cloak. The groom lay beside her, already slipping into sleep. His breathing slowed, evened out. For him, the night had ended as it should. For her, it lingered. She stared into the darkness, feeling the ache in her body and the quiet shift in her understanding of the world. Before dawn, a servant knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission. The bride was guided away, given water to wash, her movements observed with quiet attention. The sheets were removed, folded, carried away. No words were spoken, but everything was noted. She felt exposed in a way that went beyond the physical. As the sky lightened, the house stirred. Life continued. The bride was now a wife, expected to move seamlessly into her new role. She was greeted politely by those who lived there, offered food, given instructions. No one mentioned the night. It was already being absorbed into tradition, stripped of its personal weight. Days passed. The bride learned the rhythms of the household, the unspoken rules. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Her body healed, but something else remained tender. At times, she felt disconnected, as if watching herself from a distance. This, too, was not unusual. Women whispered about it in private, sharing knowing looks that carried both comfort and resignation. Rome celebrated its marriages publicly, with feasts and laughter. The darker parts were hidden behind closed doors, then buried beneath language that made them seem necessary, even noble. The bride began to understand that this was how the city survived. It turned pain into ritual, fear into duty, and silence into strength. Yet beneath her calm exterior, questions slowly formed. Was this truly the only way? Was the ritual unchangeable, or merely repeated because no one dared to stop it? These thoughts were dangerous, but they gave her a strange sense of grounding. They reminded her that she was still capable of reflection, of quiet resistance, even within the narrow space allowed to her. Time softened some edges, though it did not erase them. Weeks turned into months, and the bride, now firmly settled into her role, learned how to navigate her new life with care. She managed the household efficiently, spoke when required, listened always. On the surface, she became exactly what Rome expected. Inside, however, something subtle began to change. She noticed other women more closely now. In the marketplace, in the baths, during shared meals, she observed their expressions, the pauses in their speech. She recognized the same quiet endurance in their eyes. When they spoke of marriage, their voices remained steady, but their hands often tightened unconsciously. Without words, they shared understanding. One afternoon, while preparing offerings for a household ritual, an older woman spoke softly beside her. She did not criticize the customs directly. That would have been unthinkable. Instead, she spoke of balance, of patience, of the strength found in gentleness. Some traditions, she said carefully, remain only because they are never questioned aloud. The bride carried those words with her. They did not spark rebellion, but they did open space for thought. She began to approach her days differently, finding small moments of agency where she could. She spoke kindly to servants. She listened rather than commanded. She found that quiet care could shift the atmosphere of a room, even within rigid structures. Her relationship with her husband also changed, slowly and unevenly. He remained a product of his world, shaped by the same expectations that had governed their wedding night. Yet over time, familiarity softened his approach. He listened more. He spoke less sharply. These changes were small, but they mattered. The bride realized then that Rome's power did not only come from force. It came from repetition, from acceptance. And within repetition, there was room for slight variation. Not enough to overturn tradition, but enough to humanize it. She began to imagine a future where the ritual remained, but its harshest edges dulled by compassion. It was not the kind of change poets would celebrate. It would not be carved into stone. But it could exist quietly, passed from one household to another through example rather than decree. At night, when the house was still, she reflected on the girl she had been at the threshold. That fear had not destroyed her. It had marked her, shaped her, but it had also sharpened her awareness. She understood now why Rome tried to erase the darker parts of its rituals. Acknowledging them would mean admitting vulnerability, admitting that power had a cost. Instead, Rome preferred stories that felt clean and controlled. But real lives were neither. They were layered, complicated, and quietly resilient. The bride found comfort in that truth. It allowed her to hold both the pain of the past and the possibility of something gentler ahead. Years later, when she herself watched a new bride prepare for her wedding night, the memories returned with surprising clarity. The same garments, the same songs, the same careful avoidance of certain truths. The bride's hands trembled in a familiar way. Seeing it, she felt a deep, steady resolve settle within her. She did not challenge the ritual openly. That would have brought consequences she could not afford. Instead, she stayed close. She spoke calmly. She explained what she could, using language that framed endurance as strength rather than obligation. She reminded the young bride that fear did not mean weakness, and that survival itself was a form of power. When the moment came, she ensured the transition was as gentle as the rules allowed. Small mercies mattered. A softer tone. A pause where there was usually none. These details would never be recorded, but they would be felt. As the night passed and dawn returned, she stood in the quiet courtyard, watching light touch the walls. Rome remained unchanged in its grand structures, its laws, its myths. But within its houses, within its families, something subtle continued to evolve. The ritual did not disappear. It was too deeply woven into the fabric of the city for that. But its meaning shifted, slowly, unevenly, carried by women who remembered and chose to respond with care rather than silence alone. Rome tried to erase the darkness by refusing to name it. Yet memory persisted, passed down not as accusation, but as understanding. And in that understanding, there was space for compassion, for patience, and for the quiet hope that even the oldest traditions could one day rest more lightly on human lives. The bride, now older, felt a sense of calm she had not known before. Her life had not been free, but it had been lived with awareness. That, she realized, was its own kind of dignity.